Welcome to the World of Eora, a news and lore podcast about Pillars of Eternity and Avowed. I'm your host, Eric, aka Gingerino. Thank you so much for joining me as we dive into the history, lore, and game mechanics for the worlds that Obsidian has created for us. Hello everybody and welcome to another episode of the World of Eora. I'm your host, Eric, aka Gingerino. Thanks everyone for joining me on another episode as we dive into the history, lore, and game mechanics for Pillars of Eternity 1 and 2 and Avowed. For those wondering why we pair those games together, it's because they share the same fantasy setting known as the World of Eora. If you're new to the show, welcome to the show. Happy to have you here. On this podcast, we basically just dive into the world that these games are in, explore the narratives and the lore behind them to just appreciate the world that Obsidian has made, help you to appreciate the games a little bit more, maybe come up with a new role to play in the game, inspire you for a new run-through, or perhaps help you to develop a tabletop role-playing game, or just geek out and appreciate a fantasy world that we know and love. If you are new, I'm going to signpost you towards episode 0, where I can signpost you further towards episodes that are foundational for the lore of this world, such as how magic works and what different races there are and who the gods are of this world. But if you want to start here, you can as well, although I will say today is going to be a little bit spoilery, and by a little bit I mean a lot, for Avowed and Pillars of Eternity. What I want to talk about today cannot really be talked about without really spoiling the entirety of all the games. So if you haven't finished Avowed, or if you are interested in playing Pillars of Eternity 1 or 2 and you haven't finished those games, then today's maybe an episode you want to consider skipping. Otherwise, if you are down for that, today we are going to be talking about an entity known as Sapadal. And this is an episode that I have wanted to do for a while, but I wanted to give lots of people time to, play through the game and learn about things and figure out stuff. As well, it just always seemed like it was such a big topic, but it's one that has to be done at some point in time. And so this is what we're going to be talking about today, about this entity known as Sapadal. And so this is your last warning. There is spoilers ahead. If you don't want to have any spoilers, then stop now, because I'm not going to hold back once we get to the other side of this transition.
Half the locals would arrest you for trespassing, and the rest would kill you outright. I'm curious, what exactly did you find there?
All right, so we're going to be talking about the god known as Sapadal. And the Sapadal, if you don't already know, is the deity that is behind your character in Avowed, the Envoy. For a little bit of background, the thing that makes your Envoy character unique and special, as you'll probably know if you're aware of who or what Sapadal is that you are a godlike creature within this world. And every person or thing that is a godlike has a patron deity behind their nature. One of the other people that we see in the game of Avowed, Sargamus, is an Aethys godlike, related to the god Aethys. He could also be called a light godlike or a dawn godlike or something of that sort. How godlike is made is essentially when a normal set of parents are pregnant with a child, that child can have their soul touched, if you will. They have what's called a chime implanted into their soul by one of the gods of Eora, and these people are born with physiological expressions that kind of mimic the flavor and personality of that god. If you were a fire god, like for example, which comes from the goddess Magran, you would have flames for hair, or you would have, sparks crackling and following behind you. Your skin might look like the top of lava or obsidian or something like that. You would have fire for eyes or something like that. Devil horns and all the like. And in the game of Avowed, you are a Sapadal godlike, or a Sapadalian godlike, or as I like to call it, a fungal godlike, because of all the fungal growths. You could also think of yourself, I guess, as a Dream Scourge godlike, if you really want to, but there's no, formal naming for it, it's just kind of what works. You are a godlike that comes from the goddess Sapadal. And there is a major difference between your character and other godlike in that other godlikes have what is referred to as a chime, which I like to think of as your soul resonates at the same, resonance or pitch or tone or timbre, whatever, some sort of musical term, resonates the same way that the god does that gave you their chime. But with Sapadal and your player character, the Envoy, you are described as having a thorn within your soul. And so I almost think of it as like this thorn is stuck inside your soul, and it's almost causing a growth in your soul that makes you the thing that you are. It's kind of the same as a chime, but also very clearly different in its nature and how it works, which is very fitting because Sapadal is also very different in her very origin. Sapadal, as far as we are concerned, or that we know as the observers of this universe through these games, is the first and maybe only deity in the world of Eora that exists from natural means. If you have played Pillars of Eternity 1 or 2, then you will probably know this, that the rest of the Eoran gods, which unfortunately are very not present in the game of Avowed. I was really hoping to have much more interaction with the deities in Avowed, but we didn't, and I understand why from a lore perspective and a narrative perspective. It makes sense. But the rest of the gods of Eora, Woodica, one of the gods we get to interact with, the other gods that we overhear things and conversations with if you collect god totems throughout Avowed, such as Skain or Wal or Galawain, these other deities that you get to hear their voices of and histories and interactions with, those gods were actually created by Kith creatures, and Kith is the name that are given to the people that live on the world of Eora. So the normal, mundane people that exist on the planet of Eora created the gods. Now, not in some hoity-toity way like everyone believed hard enough in the deities and they became real. No, the ancient society of the Ingwithans sought out the existence of gods, couldn't find anything, concluded therefore that there was no such thing as gods, and decided to create their own. The higher echelon of the Ingwithan society essentially came up with this master plan to sacrifice their entire civilization and use the abundance of soul energy, known as essence, that came from that cataclysm or that genocide of their people to actually form and create the gods as we know them. There's a whole bunch of other stuff that's going on behind the scenes there. I'm not going to dive into the details of it, but that's kind of like the bird's eye view of what happened. The Ingwithans sacrificed their entire civilization, thus creating the gods, and these 11 deities that we have in the Eoran pantheon kind of represent the Ingwithan people and what they viewed and what they believed in a variety of different approaches. At least that's kind of the idea behind it. And so every one of those deities that exist, even Skain, represents some part of the Ingwithan culture or people in some way, shape, or form. But the thing that's really important about them is that they are artificial gods. Now, they can function like deities do, or at least how we think they do in terms of fantasy media and stories, but they are artificial, and that does matter. And I agree with the narrative of Pillars of Eternity that fact does matter. Just because they can function as gods, the fact that they can be created means that they are not nearly as supernatural or as holy as they make themselves out to be. And I do think that fact matters, and the gods think so as well, because they try to keep this fact hidden. Sapadal, though, is a different story. You see, because in the Living Lands, this continent, or this large island, is separated from the rest of the world at large. And the reason that this matters is because the rest of the world is connected through these deep underground veins of Adra. Adra is these giant green crystalline structure that you see jutting out of the ground. In Avowed, we get to see overgrown pieces of Adra that we can get clear out of the way. In Pillars of Eternity 1 and 2, we get to see spires of Adra all the time. And Pillars of Eternity is the namesake for Adra. You see a book at the very beginning of Avowed that pretty much outlines that. The major idea behind Adra and what it does is essentially it's a conduit between here and now and the beyond where the gods are. And so when you die, the soul that you have leaves your body, and it would transport through the Adra to where the gods are, stay there for a while, and then eventually they would transport through the Adra back into our mundane world, enter into a new body. And this is a cycle of reincarnation known as the Wheel. I don't know why I'm explaining all these things to you like you don't know them. We're talking about endgame spoilers, but if for whatever reason you weren't aware, you needed a recap, here you are, and this is what we're talking about. The reason that Living Lands is so important is, as we learn through the game of Avowed, that the Living Lands is actually separated. It's disparate from the rest of the Adra network that we see throughout the globe or the world of Eora. And so the essence that leaves people's bodies goes into the Adra that's on Living Lands, but it doesn't go to the beyond where the gods are. It just cycles back into the Living Lands itself until it finds its way back into another new body. This explains why the Living Lands is so lush and fertile and vibrant, is because it is quite literally full of life. Like, people come here and they die, and their soul now is stuck in this perpetual soul machine that keeps all of that there. So anytime, people come to the Living Lands, if anyone who is there dies, they are now adding their essence to this giant vat of essence that is already there. At some point in time, all of this essence just existing in the Living Lands, churning and being recycled over and over again, eventually formed some sort of consciousness, or at least this is how I'm understanding how Sapadal came to be, is that this essence, which has been infused and suffused throughout the Living Lands in this cycle of reincarnation, but just in an isolated form, this essence that's been suffused throughout the land eventually formed its own consciousness. And this isn't really a crazy idea. Essence is the seat of memory, personality, and consciousness, after all, within this world. And so it could make sense that eventually, if enough essence was pooled in an area, or that it was, being cycled and churned and interacting with new essence coming in and coming out, so constantly having this new life added to it rather than, stagnating and becoming corrupt. It's not outside the realm of possibility, obviously, as we see in the game, that essence could form some own sort of self-consciousness or awareness of itself, which is a crazy thing to think about. Like, from a perspective of just playing a game and hearing the story, it's pretty cool. Like, oh yeah, these souls eventually grew aware of itself and Sapadal, the god, was born. But the idea that you have this stuff, this ethereal matter known as essence, that it has the capacity to grow a consciousness, which is like one of the most complex things that we're still trying to study in our own real world and understand. Where does consciousness come from? Why do we, especially as humans, seem to have this level of consciousness that we don't see within other creatures that exist within the world? Is there something about us that's unique? Like, how does it come about? We don't really have an answer for that. There's a lot of different answers, and this especially starts to dive into the area of, faith and religion if we really want to get there. But there's also a deep science behind it and trying to understand how this even occurs in the first place. And we don't live in a fantasy world where there's, magic and dragons and things like that. And so we don't think we're going to run into any Sapadal-like situations in our world. But it's really cool to see kind of Obsidian's answer in this fantasy world of this essence, this stuff that is suffused with life, is actually able to generate consciousness. And it's not only is it able to generate consciousness, it's able to generate an entire entity that can utilize and make actionable all this consciousness that it has. It becomes aware of itself, and then it can actually act upon the world that is within. Sapadal essentially becomes the deity of the Living Lands itself, having a deep connection with the very land that it is and the people that are living upon it. But Obsidian Entertainment asks another very interesting question around the idea of gods and goddesses and deities and divine creatures and all that. Because we're often very used to deities and these kind of entities existing in fantasy media as these like overlords over the entire world, these supreme beings with high intellect and wisdom or some sort of personality, or they might be evil or have some sort of flaw about them that's been exaggerated to a million because they are divine beings with a flaw. But they're always kind of grown up. The deities of the world are always kind of grown up. You might have some childish ones, but they're still kind of matured in some way, shape, or form. But Sapadal is presented as this deity as you play through Avowed and understand the history of her interactions with the Living Lands and the people that lived there, the Akedan people, known as the Godless throughout the game. You get to see kind of what happens in the world when there is a god who is actually a child or even a toddler, and what kind of atrocities can occur as a result. Because Sapadal being born into the world as the first normal organic god, they didn't really have a child rearing, and they just sort of have this consciousness and awareness, and they have all this energy and potential and stuff that they can actually do within the world, but they have no way of understanding the world. They don't know who they are. They don't know what they're doing. They're just running on pure kind of feelings and emotion and instinct at this point. And so Obsidian creates this situation of what would it be like if there was a god who was quite literally a child. And when you think about that long enough, it actually is a terrifying prospect. This thing that can wield unimaginable and almost infinite amounts of power to do anything that crosses its whim. And we, just regular mortal creatures, are going to kind of be at the mercy of whatever that thing feels and wants to do. That's terrifying. For anyone who's had toddlers, you know that's terrifying. I remember watching Studio Ghibli, whatever your preference is, watching their movie Spirited Away, and there was a giant baby in that movie, and I remember thinking that was the most terrifying thing in that entire movie. And it was a weird movie to begin with, because I'm not going to dive into it, but it's a weird movie. There's a giant baby in that movie, and I remember thinking to myself, that's terrifying, because a baby doesn't have mercy in it. You know what I'm saying? Like, a baby just runs on pure instinct. If they are mad at you for something, they will just hit you and they will pummel you. And so if you had a giant baby that was literally, twice the size of you and super strong and powerful, if you make that thing angry, very realistically, it could end your life just because it's mad. And it's really sad to think about like an infant or something doing that. But you know what I'm getting at? Now we have this god in this world of Eora that essentially has this unlimited power, and these people that are living on the living lands, the Akedans, are kind of at the mercy of a toddler sitting in the god's seat of the world. I'm not sure if the Akedans are aware about this. I don't know if they know that their god is in this kind of infant stage, but they develop this relationship with their god. Fantasy worlds, mortal creatures, worshipping divine creatures is not all that unheard of, and there is already obvious signs of religion and faith within the world of Eora, so it's not out of the question that these people would detect the reality of a god and then begin worshipping and following it. And that's what the Akedan, the godless people, end up doing. But for multiple reasons, this god continues to have tantrums, which just lay waste to the entire continent of the living lands. At one point, I believe one of the Akedans chopped down a tree, and Sapadal has a complete and utter hissy fit, and a lot of people die as a result. At one point in time, Shatterscarp was supposedly part of the ocean. It was, it was a sea of some sort, and Sapadal again had a temper tantrum, and now it is a desert wasteland. But still, because of a number of notable people throughout the Godless's history, they try to stay true, or maybe not, depending on the choices you make, because your player character has a part of this. The Akedan people continue to follow Sapadal, although it kind of is indicated near the end of the Akedan's lifetime, while they're at the Living Lands before tragedy strikes, that they were kind of getting sick and tired of this deity, and they didn't really follow her anymore. And Sapadal is obviously confused about all of this. It's very easy, I think, to make a monster out of this divine creature because of the atrocities that they inflict, but they also have no idea what it is they're doing. They don't understand the value of the lives of these Kith people, and they don't understand the outcome and the result of what their actions have, right? Like, they are essentially a toddler. It isn't until much later, after catastrophe strikes, that Sapadal really starts to wrestle with these ideas as she grows and matures to understand a bit more about the world and interacts with you, the envoy, who helps teach her about what life is and the reality of the world that she has kind of been born into. Unfortunately, she is thrust into a kind of a awful predicament because catastrophe does strike. Eventually, the other gods of Eora, the artificially created ones, learn about Sapadal's existence. You get a hint of this in Dawnshore when you collect all of the Woodaka totems, and you can hear a conversation between the god Woodaka and the god Helia when they're discussing this entity that they have detected within the living lands, and they're able to conclude that there is some sort of divine being there. Woodaka senses it as a threat. And in fact, all of the gods kind of view this entity as a threat in some way, shape, or form. Some of the gods are obviously against the idea of news about this god's existence getting out because it might oust their own secret, but they're also a little bit concerned about, what are we dealing with here? This is a completely unknown entity who has the same amount of power, or possibly more, than us, the rest of the gods of this world, that we are in control of. You understand? This is a big deal to them. It's not just some other god on the scene. It's a completely unknown factor, and they don't know what kind of power this thing wields, whether it's going to threaten to upend everything that they have built or worked towards. It's a complete unknown, and Some of the gods can live with this because you're very like life-loving, and they're not just gonna kill something because they don't understand it. But a lot of the gods are able to express this very real concern that they would have as, living entities, that like, we don't know what this is or what kind of threat it is to us. And eventually, the goddess Woodica, goddess of rightful rulership, law, justice, and vengeance, Woodica sends over mage folk to the living lands, which is a very unique creature within this world I'll talk about in a second, essentially to wipe out all of the Ekedans, the godless people that live there, and then destroy Sapadal. Although they don't have a name for her yet, just basically just destroy this entity. And so Woodica creates these mage folk, or mag folk as they're pronounced within the game. I'm always going to call them mage folk, but I'll try to call them mag folk for the rest of this episode. Mag folk are really interesting because they are essentially a creature that is created for a purpose within the world by one of the gods. They didn't happen through evolution. They weren't created as a pretty little thing to just hop through the forest and be part of the ecosystem. They are a creature or a being that is created by one of the gods specifically for some sort of purpose, whatever that purpose may be. And in the case of the magfolk that we see, or the magfolk that we see within Avowed, they were created by Woodica for the purpose of eradication of an entire people group and the god that they worship. So essentially, mass genocide. That's what these magfolk were created for. Now, magfolk very often have been depicted in a quite robotic fashion, like the eyeless from the White March DLC, or the magfolk that we see here in the Living Lands. But there are other magfolk beyond that are, I think, a little bit more biological, but it seems that they have some sort of mechanical structure to them, despite the fact that they are sentient creatures. They are not just robots that run around and do what they're told, although they do what they're told because they are created even with biological programming. And if you're interested in learning more about the magfolk, especially from Avowed, then, one, I have an episode called Magfolk that you can go listen to from a long time ago, but also recently, I did an episode called The Magfolk Orisons of the Garden, which are essentially a bunch of letters about the magfolk in Avowed. Long story short, they were sent to the Living Lands to destroy the Ekedan people and destroy their god, which we now know as Sapadal, and then that was what their created function was for. They got to the Living Land, and they were able to destroy all the Ekedan people, but they weren't able to find where the god was, and they were essentially disconnected from their patron deity, or their creator deity, if you will, Woodica, and they start to question the reality of who they are. They didn't even have an idea of an identity about themselves, because they're out of touch with their very creator. They don't know what their purpose is, and they start to spiral as a result. Eventually, they do find Sapadal, and they imprison her. And it is from this prison that Sapadal is able to reach out to you, the envoy. We don't necessarily know how the envoy becomes a fungal godlike. I like to think that their parents came to the Living Lands for some reason and conceived the child there in the Living Lands, but we don't actually technically know. Perhaps Sapadal has some level of influence that she can reach outside of Living Lands. We don't know how. Or maybe there is some level of godlikeness that can be passed on through generations. Perhaps there was a person who went to the Living Lands and caught, for lack of a better word, the thorn of Sapadal and then passed it on to one of their future lives. I'm not really sure of the details, or at least I'm not really sure. If anyone does know, or you saw some conclusive stuff about what it is, send me an email, worldofeora@gmail.com. Just because I do this podcast doesn't mean I know everything about the game, but I'm trying. Regardless, Sapadal finds herself imprisoned by the magfolk that was sent by Woodica. And even though Woodica is the one that pulled the trigger on this, she's not the only one that viewed Sapadal as a threat. You can learn this when we read Magfolk Orison 1, which is a letter that you can get in the game of Avowed, and this is written from the perspective of the magfolk that are in the Living Lands trying to wrestle with the identity of who they are. And in the very first letter of this series of letters, it talks about, or this magfolk is wrestling and discussing this idea of what the other gods say, or what these other gods might say about the existence of this insisted deity, as they refer to Sapadal as. Of Abaddon, which is the god of the forge, they say nothing can be made of that which is hoarded, so punish the hoarder. Referring to Sapadal, hoarding all this essence within the Living Lands, even though technically it's not something that they can choose to do. Of them, Berith says, Berith being the god of death and cycles and doors, they are not upon the wheel, so they do not live nor die. They are as inert as stone. going through all these deities, we see that there is kind of like almost a theological approach that these magfolk are taking. These magfolk being created by Boudica to destroy her, obviously. But there's this justification that every single one of the gods could make about why Sapadal should be destroyed. And this perspective from Berith, basically, who is the god that oversees the cycle of reincarnation known as the Wheel, since Sapadal and all of her living beings are not in the Wheel, as far as Berith is concerned, they are inert as stone, and so we can feel free to get rid of her. From the perspective of Aethys, which would be the god of light and redemption, second chances, and dusk and dawn, Aethys says there's no hope for them, as they are enthralled by the hopeless, so deliver hope unto them. The magfolk obviously redefining hope in the form of destroying them completely, because they are hopeless, so, if they have a hopeless life, then give them hope by ending their lives and putting them back in the Wheel. Galawain, god of nature and the hunt, says hunt them down even to the last child as the predator hunts even unto the prey nest. I mean, Galawain would just be in favor of the magfolk or whatever going to the living lands and, being the predator over the prey and destroying everyone, because it's the strong eating the weak that he is all behind. If you ever got behind the lore of Destiny and the whole final shape thing, Galawain would very much be a big fan of that. Hylia, goddess of birds and song, creativity, and childbirth, for whatever reason, she says, among them neither chick nor child is born with a soul, so there is no birth among them. Go make a bloody birth of them. This was surprising to hear, even if it is just kind of the musings of one of these Boudican magfolk creatures. It was surprising to hear because Hylia I always kind of picture as the life-loving god who would never want to, kill someone for just gits and shiggles of it. But even here we can see, and it's not necessary that Hylia actually thinks this, but you can reason through almost the theology, a Hylian theology, that this god Hylia would say that nobody here is really born with a soul, or at least this god wasn't born in that particular sense, and so there is no birth among them, and then so we should give them a bloody birth, which would be to say to put them within the rest of the world, or kill them off and enter them back into the Wheel, and I'm not sure, either way. Magrin would just say make war on them, Magrin being the goddess of fire and war. Andra, the goddess of forgetfulness, the ocean and the moon, says strike away all memory as the tide strikes the shape from the sand, which is very fitting of the goddess of forgetfulness, but also the goddess of grief, and I think that might be part of the motivation behind the Andrite theology. This next one is my favorite. Remergon, the goddess of entropy and final death and bad luck, and the unraveling of the fabric of the universe, or whatever else you want to say. Remergon just howls, because Remergon doesn't really care about anything. Skane, the god of retribution, violent rebellion, secret hatred, etc., etc. Very much about like overthrowing oppressors that are above you kind of thing. Skane says, make an effigy of them, disfigure them until their effacement is complete. And that's a very Skane-ish thing to say, because... yeah, Skaneite people who follow Skane are really weird. They're evil, not just for the sake of being evil, but like they're all about like they would deface their own body for the sake of potentially becoming an effigy, which is just a horrific, almost possessing of Skane into the person to basically kill a whole bunch of people, ultimately trying to kill some oppressive leader and all that. If you're interested, go ahead and listen to my episode on Skane. And lastly, Wal, the god, some sort of divine being. Nobody really knows what Wal is, but from Wallite theology, Wal would say, all the strangeness of the alien among them shall be mine. There is no stranger thing in the world, and I shall have it for my own. And this is basically just Wal saying that Sapadal's weird, and I like weird things, so now it's going to be mine. And of course, Boudica just wants to annihilate them. So like, there's theology in all 11 of these deities that say why Sapadal should not exist. And this is the beginning of these magfolk that were sent here trying to wrestle with their purpose and who they are and what they're doing. And the story of what happens to Sapadal ultimately lies with the envoy from the game of Avowed. Do they stay in their prison? Do they get absorbed and destroyed? Do they become free to be the god over the living lands? Do they become free and they also get a Titan body that they get to run around with? It's really up to you, the player character. I am interested to wonder what Obsidian might consider the canon ending. I think the normal canon ending is probably they get released Maybe they don't have a Titan body, I don't know, but they do get released and they are freed in some way. Feels like the right ending, I guess. But it's hard to say. It really could be the most evil ending. The envoy, destroys this every sign of this deity existing, and then joins the Steel Garrote as a powerful figure, and they take over the living lands and reshape it in the image of the god Woodaka. But regardless of whatever the ending is, we don't know because the world hasn't progressed beyond this point. And Sapadal is now kind of the main central focus. As much as the main focus of us on the players is our envoy character and what they have to say within the world, from a world perspective, Sapadal is now the center focus of what is happening within this world, alongside some of the very interesting endings that we see from Pillars of Eternity 1 and 2. At the end of Pillars of Eternity 2, the wheel was broken and the cycle of reincarnation is no longer functioning the way that it is supposed to. As well, the storm of Andra's Mortar has gone down, and the entire country and nation and people of Yezuha, which was the actual original nation that the Akedan godless people came from, way back in centuries past, they have now been revealed to be alive still. They've been existing within this oceanic storm for centuries upon centuries. So you have these other massive things that are going on within the world of Eora, and now we have this brand new god that is thrown within the mix. And it's interesting timing to see Sapadal be born into the world around the same time that the wheel is broken. I don't know if the two are connected. It seems a little coincidental, but at the same time, we are just writing stories, or Obsidian is just writing stories here, so who can say necessarily for sure?
If you find your trail has run cold, come to me with whatever you have. There is much I may be able to do for you.
That even though this episode is about Sapadal, there's really not a lot to say about Sapadal herself. We've talked a little bit about how she was born into this world and so has the view of a toddler or a child. And at the point, by the time the envoy gets to, really interacting with Sapadal, maybe she's grown to the point of a pre-adolescent, who knows. But because she is so new, there's not a lot of lore that we have, other than the fact that she does exist, which means that deities within this world can exist. And many of us who played Pillars of Eternity 2 remember Reke referring to the Yezuhan people on the other side of that oceanic storm having a single god. Has this occurred before within the Yezuhans? Is this a god from almost eternity past that has actually existed for a very long time? We can't say for sure. And what is the natural progress for a growing deific creature? What's going to happen with Sapadal as they continue to age and mature? What kind of powers can they develop? With them being organic, does that make them different than the other gods of Eora? Will they be able to do much more than the gods of Eora? Are they going to be bound the same way? Who knows? There's not a lot to say about Sapadal as a result, though, because the other gods, what we've found within the Eora that were created by the Inguithans, they have portfolios and domains of things that they are gods over because it's expressions of their personhood. So, you have Abidan, god of the forge. You have Aethys, god of redemption. But you don't have Sapadal, god of mushrooms. You just have Sapadal, god of the living lands. And that really, everything that the living lands encompasses is also Sapadal. The two are almost inseparable, I would say. It's almost like Sapadal is the consciousness that the living lands itself has kind of created. Which in some way I like, because I predicted before the game came out that the living lands were quite literally living. They were actually alive. And this kind of makes that true. So you know what? I'm just going to say it. I called it. But regardless, that's who Sapadal is. But we don't really have a lot of other lore. We know that she was born into this world. We know that she or it is young in its life and its view upon the world. And we know that it was imprisoned by the Mag folk that were sent over by Woodaka when the other gods detected it, and that it was either destroyed or freed by the envoy that came from Adir and went to the living lands to fix the Dream Scourge, which Sapadal unleashed upon the world, basically because she was imprisoned. And, this god has been throwing tantrums left, right, and center. No surprise that the Dream Scourge is kind of the same thing. But also, would you expect anything less from a cornered person? Of course they're going to lash out and do anything possible. So while we didn't go over a lot of crunchy lore today talking about Sapadal, I think discussing this, or at least just kind of getting all this out there, kind of gets our minds churning a little bit of what is this world about? What kind of things can happen? And where do you think Avowed could go after this? Where do you think the world of Eora can go after Avowed? And I'm interested in hearing your opinion. For those of you who've been listening to the show for a long time, or you've been playing these games and you know a lot about the world, there's a lot of directions that the world can go in right now. The Kith creatures still have to reckon with the fact that the wheel is broken, and now there's this new god on the scene that can be born or, can be brought about organically. What does this mean for the world of Eora? Personally speaking, this player, I'm not really 100% sure what to expect. Will the Kith repair the wheel in some way, shape, or form? Or now that there is a god on this side of the beyond, away from where the rest of the gods are, is this god going to reform the world and its cycle of reincarnation and uphold itself while the gods are separated? Is this going to be a new era where Sapadal becomes the god of the entire world if she's able to get out of the living land? Are the gods now going to double their efforts to get back to the here and the now so that they can stop Sapadal? Are they going to work together? Are they going to repair the wheel? What's going to happen? We do know one of the endings of the DEADFIRE can see the wheel be overseen by Bareth, so we know that the wheel can be easily repaired by the gods if push comes to shove, but one of the gods kind of has to be empowered above the others to do so. And who knows how, is there a power ceiling that Sapadal has, being a god that exists within the living lands? So I'm not sure where Eora is going to go after this. It definitely seems like there's going to be a conflict, perhaps and this seems like a very Obsidian conflict to create within a game, a conflict of people who are pro-organic god versus pro-artificial god, people who are going to want to keep the status quo of the old gods that were created by the Inguithans. Perhaps that news will get out into the world at large. And then a lot of people are going to learn about this other god that was born naturally, for lack of a better word, and people are going to be divided in every single country across the planet of what kind of god do you follow? Do you follow the natural god of this world, or are you going to follow one of the other gods that were created by people long ago, but we were more familiar with them? I could see that being an interesting kind of conflict that Obsidian might want to approach. And then getting into the nature of personhood of can these gods, these Inguithan gods that they are created, can they have the same level of godhood as an organically created god? Which is, I think, an interesting discourse to have over consciousness itself. Can a person be created? Can we create AI or something like that, where it is truly its own, it's truly self-conscious and aware the way we humans are? Or are we humans uniquely existing within this world where we have consciousness, we don't know why? There's a lot of interesting kind of conversations that come as a result. And so whenever I try to think of what's going to happen next in Eora, these are just the paths that my mind starts going down, and I don't really end up with an answer. Just to put money on it, that would be my next guess, is that at some point down the road, assuming Obsidian is going to take the IP that is Eora and continue developing that story, that one day it goes down the road to the point where people are divided on their allegiance between artificially created gods versus these organically created beings, especially with Yezuha possibly having one themselves. What do you think? Do you think Sapadal will get out of the living lands? And do you think that she's going to massively overtake things? Or will she be destroyed and be made a martyr of? Does she even escape? Would Obsidian's canon have her be destroyed by the Envoy? What would that mean for the future of Eora and the overarching narratives that are going on? Send me an email, World of Eora, anything that you guys want to have read out on the show, I will happily do so. Or if you just want to chat about it, between you and me, we can do that too. But that's all I have for today's episode. Let's close it out, shall we?
Is an oath worth the weight of a crown?
Like I said, today's episode's been a long one in the making just because I want to give people enough time for it, even though all I really did was kind of summarize what we learned in the game of Avowed, because there's not a lot of crunchy lore, at least that's what I'm calling it, about Sapadal themselves. But I'm looking forward to learning a little bit more. One thing I guess we could say is that depending on what your character chooses at the end of Avowed, is Sapadal might be running around in a giant statue, as well as existing within the living lands, but outside of that, I am really interested to hear what everyone has to say. So if you have a response to that question, or you just want to email for the sake of emailing, send an email, worldofeora@gmail.com. You can also follow the show on Twitter @worldofeora. As well, if you would like to support the show, you can do so at ko-fi.com/worldofeora. I don't expect anyone to do that. It's just there for those who find value in supporting the things that they listen to. If you would like to support the show, but you don't want to do so financially, please consider giving a rating and a review on whatever platform it is that you're on. I know Apple and Spotify both have ways of engaging with the platform, and that helps the algorithm tell other people to listen to this show, and that would be a real big help in getting the show out there. As for what I've been playing, I have not really been playing much since I finished the Altars, and I talked about that last week. I've been dipping into Avowed because I'm excited for the new summer update, so I'm trying not to play it too much because I don't want to get tired of the game before the update comes out, but I'm also chasing my final achievements. I only just finally got the stupid recipe achievement, which seemed bugged to all hell for me, but whatever. I finally got it. The only one I'm really working towards now is a Path of the Damned run, which I'm honestly, I think, more than halfway through at this point. I just never finished it, so I got that to do. But I also started a new playthrough of Tyranny. I play basically an hour a night, which is another Obsidian made game, and it's came out between Pillars of Eternity 1 and Pillars of Eternity 2, and it is in the same style, but it's a completely different world and a completely different group of people, a completely new set of lore. If anyone's ever been interested in hearing about the lore of Tyranny, by the way, I have played through the game before. Granted, and I will admit this, I have not technically finished it. I just kind of got to the end and then for whatever reason didn't finish it. I don't know why, but whatever. Maybe now I can finally finish it. But yeah, if anyone's ever been interested in hearing about the world of Terratus, or Terratus, I can never remember how it's pronounced, let me know, and maybe I'll make a bonus episode on it or something like that. But yeah, I'm playing through that. Looking forward to Neverwinter Nights 2 Enhanced Edition being released soon. I'm not generally a fan of pre-orders, but this is a game that I want to exist and that I'm going to pay for regardless. So I was like, well, 10% off to pre-order. I'm going to buy it anyways, so I may as well. So I did that. Was it a bad practice as a consumer? Maybe. I don't know. But it's too late now, so I'm just looking forward to playing Neverwinter Nights 2 when that releases. And I'll play that for as long as that game takes me, or Grounded 2 when it releases if I'm not into Neverwinter Nights. That's all I've been playing, so yeah, thanks everyone for today. Everyone listening to this episode, thank you for being here, and I hope you enjoyed the episode. It was a fun one to do, even if there wasn't a lot of meaty bits to hold on to, but it was still, I think, an interesting thing to talk about, and hopefully it got your mind working a little bit of like what might be going on in this world, and where we could see a Pillars of Eternity 3 or an Avowed 2, or in a completely new game in a different part of the world. Where would you like to see another game within the world played? Whatever. I have enough questions I've asked you. For me, it would be The White That Wins or Rawatai, but that's whatever. Thanks everyone for listening to today's episode. I've been your host, Eric, aka Gingerino, and I'll see you guys next time.